Hello, everyone. Welcome to an inside look at TrendsWatch 2016. This special event is presented by Blackbaud in collaboration with the American Alliance of Museums. Your host today is Elizabeth Merritt, Vice President, Strategic Foresight, and Founding Director at the Center for the Future of Museums, a division of the American Alliance of Museums. One piece of housekeeping before we get started. You should see a Q&A widget on your screen. You can use that to submit questions during the webinar. Elizabeth will do her best to take them as they come, but any that we don't get to during the presentation, we will take at the end of the session. And without further delay, I will turn it over to Elizabeth to introduce her special guests. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for all of you joining us today. For me, this is a very special opportunity to explore a couple of the trends in this year's report, both with you, the audience, who I hope will be lobbing questions at us throughout, and with two special guests. I'm going to be joined by Barry Joseph, who's the Associate Director for Digital Learning at the American Museum of Natural History. Barry provided much of the inspiration for the chapter on augmented and virtual reality, so I'm really looking forward to getting his expert take on it. And when we come to the second half of our program, exploring happiness as a metric of success, we're going to be joined by Gregory Dreiser, who is Director of Curatorial and Engagement at the Museum of Vancouver, a museum I always keep an eye on because they're always doing such fabulous things, including, in this case, hosting an exhibit on happiness to try and improve the happiness of their community. And with that, let me jump right in. The first thing we're going to be looking at today is a section on augmented and virtual reality, which I shamelessly named Me, We, Here, There, which is pulled directly from Barry Joseph's matrix of looking at augmented devices. And I really wanted to look at this question of technology because it seems that museums in general always have a very fraught relationship with technology. We always have anxiety attacks about whether it's here to supplant what we do, whether it's going to replace the physical experience, or whether we can use it to extend and supplement our interpretation. And augmented and virtual reality really goes right to the heart of that anxiety, because if there's anything that could ever replace the real thing, it's increasingly sophisticated forms of digital experiences that mimic the real thing. What I'm going to do is run us very quickly through the four quadrants of this matrix to line up Barry's comments, and just share a couple of thoughts that I had as I was developing the report about why we should be looking at this. Okay, so the first quadrant in the matrix are devices that look at me here. So we're looking at two different axes here. We're looking at whether we are having a social or a solitary experience, and we're looking at whether that experience is taking place somewhere else or whether it's enhancing the environment we're actually in. In this case, it's a solitary experience taking place in my real environment. And this isn't, in the grand scheme of things, particularly new. We began seeing really cool augmented reality apps that were being used by museums 6-7 years ago. One of the things that really caught my attention at the time was this was a way that people could begin to personalize their experiences with museums. So it wasn't everybody moving through the museum seeing exactly the same things and having the same experience, just the way that audio guides used to give you a personalized narrative, something that other people weren't hearing. This could give you a personalized visual experience, seeing things other people weren't seeing. But if you're delivering that through a smartphone or a tablet, it's still pretty clunky because you're having to hold up this big device in front of you to see this overlay on the real environment. So as time went on, of course, the technologists tried to tackle this, and we had the introduction of technologies like Google Glass, which tried to make it more seamless by turning it into a wearable. I tried out Glass for about a year. It's pretty much the inevitable idea. How could you have something that you could become pretty much unaware of? It could just be something that's always sitting there that you could activate by touch or voice that would begin to augment your environment. And while Google Glass is off the market, while they're refocusing it on business applications, there are lots of equivalent products in development by Vuzix and Sony and others. So at some point we're going to have a wearable that delivers augmented reality. That's, however, something that only enhances what I'm actually looking at and is just for me alone. So the next quadrant of Barry's matrix that we want to look at are experiences that can take me elsewhere, that can transport me to a different world, either a real world, in this case the LA Symphony, trying to immerse people in the experience of sitting in the symphony and hearing the music from all around them, or worlds we can't access anymore, different times, different places, other planets, or imaginary worlds. This is a way of reaching people who might never step into a museum past our doors, to give them a hint of what it might like to be in the museum, just the way the LA Phil sent their van out on the road offering people a virtual reality experience of what it would be like if they actually came to the symphony. Now, this is starting to become more accessible. Oculus Rift, which is one of the big names in this area, started shipping in March, and it costs about $600. That doesn't count the cost of the personal computer that can actually support the set and runs the kind of software it needs to interface with. But on the other hand, you've got really, really inexpensive devices for delivering virtual reality. Many of you may have a Google Cardboard, which was shipped to all New York Times subscribers last November, and they're now shipping it out to loyal digital-only subscribers in last month and this month. And even if you had to buy it off the web, you can get a Google Cardboard device for about $14. The cool thing about this is there's an increasing amount of science showing that this kind of immersive virtual reality, putting you in a different world, putting you into a refugee camp to see what it's like to be a kid having to rely on food drops, or putting you into another country or the shoes of another person, can really promote pro-social attitudes and behavior. It hits all of the neural triggers in your brain that real experiences do. It can actually trigger empathy, can trigger emotion. So these can be tremendously effective ways to try and engage people's interest and engage their sympathies with your topic. But of course, it's immensely more powerful if you can share experiences, and this is where we get to the we part of the matrix. How can we all be sharing these same digital experiences? And it also gets incredibly practical and powerful here. So I've got a shot in this picture of a virtual operating room where different people who could be based at different hospitals can log in and participate as team members in practicing what it's like to operate in the OR. I think this has immense applications for museums. Just as a former collections manager, I'm really jazzed by the idea of running simulated emergency preparedness drills in a virtual museum where we each get to play our part, helping getting people out of the museum or rescuing the objects from rising waters or dealing with a fire, things that would be very difficult and expensive to simulate, but we could actually train as a team in those environments. But the other thing is, even if you're looking at it in terms of educational experiential learning, think of all the places that you would like to be able to take groups of people so that they could learn together into the distant past. They could all be attending the Constitutional Convention. They could be wandering around a Cretaceous landscape together, seeing the animals and the plants. And it could be a more powerful learning experience because they're sharing these things. But as Barry has pointed out, the real sweet spot for museums is the we here quadrant of the matrix. Shared digital experiences that overlay information and images on the real environment you're in. Now, this is a somewhat creepy photograph of three guys who are all wearing HoloLens, and they're all gesturing at something that an imaginary digital object they're all looking at and manipulating, but they're sharing this experience. I actually got to try out a HoloLens at the annual meeting, and it was incredible because I was standing there, I'm sure, looking like a total dork in the exhibit hall, and I was seeing myself in the ancient Roman Forum, looking around and seeing people walking around me, and in an overlay that put itself in the actual exhibit hall of the Museum Expo. Now, there are obvious, really powerful and interesting gaming applications for this, and that's why a lot of people are pouring money into it, because it has really great applications for gaming where there's a lot of money. So you're already seeing people saying, well, you could have people play fantasy football and manipulate players on a table by wearing HoloLens, where you're both seeing the same game. And really, this isn't a new idea. I'm sure many of you are old enough or have watched in reruns Star Wars, where there was a famous scene where Chewbacca and C-3PO were playing this holographic game with all sorts of alien critters. That's basically the kind of experience that you can create with a shared augmented reality device like HoloLens. But as with many technologies that are developed primarily for a big commercial market, it has incredible spin-off value for places like museums that can draft on those developments. It creates new formats for storytelling. It can revitalize old industries. This is why the New York Times, I think, is pouring itself into immersive journalism and sending out Google Cardboard. They're hoping that VR can act as an empathy engine that will engage people with stories in a way that print journalism currently isn't. So it's got real potential as a way for museums to reach beyond our walls and engage the interest and empathy of people who we want to involve in our work. So with that introduction, I want to go ahead and bring Barry online so he can tell us more about his matrix, which he developed. Barry, are you on the line now?
Here I am.
Hey.
Hi, Elizabeth.
That was a
Thanks
great
for having me here
noise.
today with you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm so glad to have you. So, and I
what
should
a beautiful
say
job
that
you did describing this framework. Thank you so much. I feel like I can go home now.
And now that I have this, now you're not off the hook, because I mean you came up with this over a year ago. So I'm going to push you on revisiting it. Because we haven't talked about this in a while. I want to know, first of all, are you still finding it a useful way to frame your thinking about AR and VR in museums? And what has come across your radar since then that may have extended your thinking?
Oh, absolutely. I found myself using it all the time. I'm an ed tech person, which means I tend to be inclined towards the technology, even though I'm trying to think about the educational affordances. So part of what I found so useful is that this doesn't describe the tools at all, what has wires and what doesn't, or are you wearing it on your head or not. It's describing the effect it has on you as the user, both from a social perspective and from a spatial perspective. And so I can give you two recent examples, actually. One, a sporting example, and a museum one. Sporting. So I was at a baseball game just a few weeks ago with my family. We were seeing the Mets. And growing up, I loved going to see the Mets because whether they won or whether they lost, I always got to have a box of Cracker Jacks, which I loved eating. But my favorite part was getting the prize. You know, you always get a prize inside your box of Cracker Jacks, some little toy you can play with. And we're watching the game a few weeks ago, and I got my box of Cracker Jacks. I hadn't been in a while. And I was surprised because what I pulled out of the box, you know, surrounded by the yummy caramel popcorn, wasn't a little toy. It was just a little piece of paper that when I opened it up had a sticker on it, and the sticker was an augmented reality target. And what it invited me to do was to download an app and put it focused on the sticker, and it told me it was going to give me a baseball-themed game. Well, immediately I wasn't happy. First of all, I wanted my physical object because I was expecting that. But more importantly, it was a disconnect for what I was doing at the baseball game. Being at the baseball game with my family was social. We were experiencing something together there, and I wanted to watch the game. The idea of spending time personally going to the App Store and downloading the app and then being able to look at it myself on my phone and then play a game which was, albeit baseball-themed, had nothing to do with what was happening at the real baseball game at the moment. So being able to think about not only that I didn't like it, but why, using the framework was helpful for me. I needed something social. I needed something but it ended up being on the me side. And I needed something that was about keeping me where I was, in the here space. Instead, it was trying to send me there, somewhere else. So very quickly, the framework helped me go, okay, this is why it's not to say that augmented reality couldn't be used at a baseball game, but that wasn't what I'd want to do there. At the same time, recently I was down in D.C., your neck of the woods, at the National Museum of Natural History during the AAM conference, and we went to the room called I think it's called the Bone Room. one of the oldest rooms at the museum, and it's lots of bones of different animals. And they created an app called Skin and Bones. And it's hard to miss it. As soon as you walk in, there are signs that tell you about it. There are spots that tell you where you can stand. And even the website, when you go to the information about the hall, it's actually all about the app. And what the app does is, just like it's described, it puts skin on the bones. So all of these bones that you see and trying to figure out what these animals are, this app lets you hold up the phone. So there's an experience of you or as I did with my family, holding it in front of the bones, and then suddenly I got to see the skin on it. I got to see what the animal actually looked like, and many of them actually were then initiating some movement. So how did it climb or how did it walk? So it took this very static thing behind glass and it brought it to life, and that was something that I enjoyed a lot. So why did I enjoy it? Using the Matrix? Well, I was there to experience the museum with my family, and so we together had fun holding up the device and trying to connect it and seeing what it might do, and it had me notice the space I was in. I was there to look at the objects. So again, the Matrix was helpful for me from a social and a spatial perspective to see why the design of that augmented experience gave me something that I really enjoyed. So yes, a year out, I still, Elizabeth, find it tremendously useful to help me understand not only what I want to see in our museum here in New York at the American Museum of Natural History, but why the things that I see offered in the world, whether a commercial product that's in my Cracker Jacks box or an educational experience in the museum in D.C. might or might not be working.
Well, that's really interesting. I was listening to a talk the other day about what kind of interactions take place between parents and kids that have the highest impact on kids' learning and create experiences that they really remember later. And the speaker was saying that a characteristic of the highest impact interactions are when the child and the adult are both looking at the same thing and having a back and forth, a substantive back and forth about what they were seeing or conjecture about it. And it seems to me that actually being able to share that and the fictional experience of seeing what the animal would have looked like when it had skin or when it was alive gives you more to talk about. I've had people talk to me in the past about how there's a gap, for example, in natural history museums between people who know enough to fuel their imagination about what a dinosaur would have looked like when it was alive or what the fish would have looked like when it was alive. But there are people coming in without that kind of background. So how do you have a meaningful shared conversation about that imaginary whole animal? And there's an example where augmented reality can give them a common place to have those rich interactions.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Elizabeth. I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, that's one of the bases of our most recent augmented reality experience here at the AMNH called Micro Rangers, which is a mobile game that invites the visitors to shrink down to the microscopic level and go inside our exhibits, our permanent exhibits behind the glass, and interact with both virtual scientists and microbes to solve threats to biodiversity. And at many of the beats along the way, we intentionally tried to create points where we are asking the players to look at something so that the family or the group that's there together are looking together at the exhibit and then talking about it and making a decision. So you might be at a wall that's full of all sorts of beautiful coral, and the game says pick which coral you want to shrink down and go inside and take a photo of it. So it creates an opportunity for the family unit to look together and then make a decision and then act on that decision together using the device. And we try to create as many moments as we can where we're asking people to look at something. We're asking the players to look together and make decisions.
That's really nice. I think that we have a parallel here. A lot of times when people are grumbling a little bit about technology in museums, and the technology could be as simple as a cell phone with which you're taking photographs, and people worry about whether that's distracting attention, taking attention away from the real thing. And I think I've seen a number of persuasive essays saying that they can be mechanisms for focusing attention. So that the act of composing a photograph and choosing what you're going to take a picture of, and is that capturing what you want it to see, or with an augmented or virtual reality app, directing your attention to look for something or find something or compare something, can actually give people a scaffold for a kind of attentive viewing that they might not come in prepared to do on their own.
Absolutely. I mean, we know working in museums that the more museum literate the visitors are, the more they can get out of the experience. And in a museum like a natural history museum, we have high expectations for how a visitor can take meaning from it on their own without other scaffoldings, as opposed to, say, an interactive science center, right? So being able to train visitors how to look and how to gain meaning from looking not only helps them learn more, it makes them want to come back, and it makes their experience of the natural world in our context richer for them. So to the extent that we can use augmented reality to train visitors how to look and develop those skills, or use the skills they already have and strengthen them, then augmented reality, rather than disconnecting them from the museum experience, is actually going to enhance it. Not just for that visit, but for the future.
And I think that's the way to start thinking about how to use these technologies. I think, to go back to your Cracker Jack analogy, it's almost as if somebody sat down and said, well, how can we shovel this technology into the box, rather than starting from the kind of experience they wanted people to have. So now I want to go back and think in my head, if I were sitting in that baseball park, what kind of augmented or virtual reality experience would I want to have? And I guess maybe for me, knowing very little about baseball, if I could have a shared augmented reality app that displayed facts about the players above their heads as I was looking at them, it might give me something to talk about with the person next to me who knew more about them or knew more about baseball than I did.
Yeah, baseball is a game of statistics. And so when you're sitting there looking around the stadium, you're looking at numbers that are all over the place: the speed of the ball, the status of the batter, how many strikes are they facing, how many balls so far. The batting average of the batter might be up on the screen. So there's just numbers everywhere. But that's the designers of the baseball stadium experience trying to figure out, what do you want to know, when do you want to know it, and how do they put it where you want to see it. An augmented experience like you described can let you be in control of that process. So if my child asks me something about somebody in left field, if I can hold up my phone and see their number in some context, and it could show me that information, then it can give me the information I want, personalized to my family's needs on demand.
Yeah, and back to the personalization again, because I think that's a tremendously powerful thing about these apps.
That's right. Now, as you mentioned, these ideas, as I started thinking about them, aren't new. These devices and the experience have been around for a while. But last year, when I started trying to frame, just for myself, how to understand its impact in museums, most of this was conceptual. I too had an opportunity to try Google Glass, but everything else was just something we were reading about. We were reading about what these devices might do in our lives. 2016 is very different than 2015. This is the year we actually get to play with so many of these devices, either because they're for sale or because the developer kits are available as well. And it's been exciting now to see us not only talk about them in the conceptual space, but because we're actually getting to try things that people are making. You experienced, for example, being able to experience, was it the Coliseum you mentioned, or is it something else?
Yeah.
The Coliseum, right? I had another experience of the Coliseum as well. When I was at AAM in the exhibit space, I did things like go into a World War I battle. I got to pretend to be a Wright brothers on an airplane. I lied down on a table and pretended to take off in the plane. And we're getting to experience all these different ways that people are conceiving of not just what this might be, but these are things they actually want to offer into our spaces. And it's helping us think about it at a much faster pace, and I'm seeing much more conversation about it. In fact, last week I was just at the Games for Change Festival in New York City. If our listeners are not familiar with it, it's 13 years old. This is the 13th festival. It's an annual event in New York City that goes across a number of days, looking at how games can be used not just for entertainment. And so we've seen many threads over the years. Games for education is always strong. There was a games and, I think, brain science thread this year as well. But this was the first year that, I'm not exaggerating, every single session I went to was about virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, or some combination of them. And sometimes it was people from the gaming industry, someone from like Magic Leap, who's making a device, or Jesse Schell, who runs a gaming company, talking about it. And sometimes it was educators or someone like myself in museums. But everybody was talking about it. And there's a lot of new expectations around it. In fact, somebody tweeted at the conference, they said, "Do you hear that? It's the sound of a bubble inflating." And it's true. We're getting big expectations around it. But there was also a report that came out recently that said that when people were asked what they expect from it, games are on there, but education was actually higher. So people have, in this one survey, they found people have higher expectations of mixed reality and augmented reality and all this having an impact in the education sphere, even more than in the gaming space. I think that's something we get to try and speak to.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought up impact, because we actually have a question, which is actually being lobbed at us Billy Wattenpaw of Zengalt, who's the gentleman who lent me his HoloLens to try out at the annual meeting. Thank you, Billy. And he's asking about whether he knows of any studies that have been done to show an increase in engagement or shifts in behavior through the use of AR and VR. And one thing I came across in the course of writing TrendsWatch was the fact that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is actually putting a fair amount of effort into studies to track the large-scale, long-term effects of virtual reality on teaching empathy because they want to foster a more empathetic society. There definitely is research that indicates that augmented reality can change people's attitudes and behavior. So I think that that's one of the both promising and disturbing things about the technology, because, of course, anything that can manipulate attitudes and manipulate how we think about other people both has a tremendous potential for good, but also can be a dangerous form of manipulation.
Yep. So it's, again, another literacy we're going to have to become aware of.
Yeah.
Arm ourselves with. The app I was talking about before, Skin and Bones, was developed by Diana Marquise, who's actually a graduate student who developed this as her research dissertation. And if you go to my blog, mooshme.org, MOOSHME.org, you can scroll down and you'll see a post called Skin in the Game. And so she talks about the research that underlied why it was designed the way it was and what she was trying to study as a result. The study will be coming out in a few months. And I think work like hers, creating VR and AR experiences in museums that are designed to help us understand how does it change the way visitors learn and interact with each other and with the museums themselves are going to be tremendously helpful for guiding this kind of work as we move forward.
And I think that's one of the things that makes museums great partners for the technology industry in order to test real-world beneficial applications of their work. So we have a question coming in from Beverly Sensbach from the Florida Museum of Natural History. She would like you to give an example of a mixed reality experience and how it differs from augmented. So how does that fit into the terminology we've introduced?
I'm so glad you asked, because it's something I've been trying to get my head around as well. I really came across the term, for me in a serious way, 2 issues of Wired ago. If you don't read Wired, I recommend going to Wired.com and looking for I think it was the May issue. It was the cover article. And Kevin Kelly, one of the executive editors, tried every single tool he could and wrote a wonderful piece about what he experienced. And in it, he used the term mixed reality a lot. And he was interviewing, in part, folks from Magic Leap. And Graham Devine from Magic Leap spoke last week at Games for Change, and this is his definition. He says mixed reality is the mixture of the real world and virtual worlds so that one understands the other. Now, all these things are about connecting the real and the virtual, but what I think Kevin Kelly and Graham Devine are focusing on is the ability for the two spaces to be aware of each other. So let's talk about augmented reality. For micro-rangers, you have a coin that you hold. It's a special coin, and when you hold it and you hold your phone over it, you see characters that appear in your hand and talk to you. So in this case, all the phone is aware of, all the augmented reality is aware of, is just the coin in your hand. It's not aware of your hand. It's not aware of what your hand's in front of. The rest of the world it's blind to. I think the idea of mixed reality is when the device can now not only observe the coin itself, but everything else in front of it. So the new devices now, like an HTC Vive, when you put them on, they are mapping out the entire space around you. Microsoft HoloLens does the same thing. So rather than having something specific and discrete be the thing that can be the portal essentially into this magic virtual world, everything around you becomes a potential place for the computer to write onto. So it could be, once it's aware of my room, in this place it's going to put up a movie browser. Over here it's going to put up a Skype screen so Elizabeth and I can talk to each other. Over here it's going to let me put a Minecraft table on top of my couch, let's say. And so mixed reality in some ways is just enhanced augmented reality, but I think it affords something in a new way that's exciting a lot of people.
Yeah, so is this another example? I've been reading about the integration of haptics into augmented and virtual reality. So, for example, it's not just that you're seeing things, but you're feeling things, and you can use gestural control. So if I put on a haptics glove, for example, in a virtual reality environment with a virtual dog, I've seen a video of this, I could be petting the dog and fondling its ears and playing with its mouth, and the virtual dog would know what I'm doing because it's interacting with the signals from my hands, so it would respond appropriately. immediately. Be happy that I'm scratching its ears or jumping up and down or biting at my hand. So in this case, it's actually a responsive environment again. Is that another example of mixed reality?
I think the terms are going to shift based on how we need them. If adding the haptics is about having different mediums of experience and having a term that describes not just the visual and the audio, but the tactile as well, that might be where we go. But I think we're going to see in the next few years, we're going to go through a number of terms. We're going to, virtual worlds, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. At the end of the day, I think what's most important for us in the museum space is to think about what kind of experiences are we trying to create and what can the tools support. And different tools will support different types of experiences. If the haptic is important because you want visitors to experience, say, what happens when an earthquake appears, or their emotional shift if it's being measured when they touch a virtual dog, then you'll look for tools that support that. For people who are designing the games, the people who are designing the tools, the people designing the technology and the code, it's really important for them to be able to distinguish in their space these different tools. I think for us at the end of the day, say let them hash out what it's going to be called, and for us, as long as we're focusing on the impact it has on the social in our spaces, that's going to get us the farthest.
Cool. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our discussion. I'm going to ask you to stay on the line, Barry, because our next subject is happiness, and I think that we're going to find that topic may actually intersect with the potential of AR and VR. So I look forward to you jumping back in a little bit.
Sounds good. I'll hang out in the green room and call me when you want me to come back in.
Great. Okay. So the next topic that our hosts from Blackbaud invited me to address in a little more depth here in our webinar today is the section of the TrendsWatch report that looks at happiness as an alternative metric of success. And the reason I started writing about this, frankly, is that I've been kind of fed up with the fact that, at least in Western society, we seem so fixated on money as a way of telling us how successful an organization or a person is. If you make a high salary, you're more important than somebody who makes a low salary. If your company generates a lot of profits, you're obviously more successful than a company that doesn't generate so much profit. And that immediately disadvantages nonprofits, where we're not putting the generation of a lot of money at the top of our list of things we're trying to achieve. We're trying to make the world a better place in a lot of ways that may not involve generating money, unfortunately, either for the people who work there and certainly not for a set of investors. And the sort of culmination of this money as the ultimate metric is reflected in how nations strut their stuff and show off how successful they are. And I'm putting up here an example of the U.S. gross domestic product. So how is the U.S. doing? How is it doing compared to Germany or China or Japan? We compare gross domestic products. Well, I was very encouraged as I dug into the literature to find that more and more people and organizations and countries are pushing back at financial metrics. It's the only way of measuring success, and they're starting to layer on alternate measures that privilege things like well-being and happiness and peace of mind. So, for example, almost over a decade ago, Bhutan started floating the idea of a gross national happiness index, saying we may not be the richest country in the world, we may not be the most productive country in the world, but we think we have a high quality of living for our people, and there are ways to measuring that in terms of well-being. Now, you may or may not agree with specifically how Bhutan's measuring it or whether they're really living up to that promise, but more and more countries, France, Great Britain, are beginning to adopt elements of that measure and layering it on top of financial success as a way of looking at whether they're actually providing well for their citizens. I think this is a fabulous metric for museums because it allows us to pivot from something that is a byproduct of what we do, which is perhaps generating economic impact, and centering on what we're trying to do, which is delivery of mission. Now, our mission isn't always to make people happy, but I think a lot of what we do in creating the experiences we create do improve well-being and impact on things like personal happiness. And beginning to mainstream that into our operations as something we're consciously trying to create and capture can help us challenge funders and governments to accept us on our own terms of success. Now, I have to say this is aided by the fact that people are finding that, in fact, if you focus on making people happy, you also, as a byproduct, tend to make them more productive and make companies more profitable. There's a lot of interesting research out there. I have one graph up on the screen now showing that if you focus on the happiness of your employees, you reduce expensive and costly things like burnout and turnover and absenteeism, and you increase people's feelings of pride about their workplace, and you improve their job performance and their customer service, so that, in fact, by focusing on happiness as an outcome, you also tangentially improve your financial metrics, which makes it easier to make the case to administration. I think that one of the reasons that there's been pushback against adopting happiness and well-being as official metrics in organizations or in government has been that it seems very squishy. Are we making people happy? How do you measure that? And I think that one of the things behind the increasing adoption and acceptance of happiness as a valid metric is the fact that we're beginning to study it scientifically. So that you have, for example, people doing brain scans of Buddhist monks to show that when they're focusing on meditation and well-being, you can actually see how it's changing the activity of their brains. I actually, the other day, came across a mathematical article that was not only establishing that there is a formula to predict happiness, but modifying an existing formula to account for your awareness of how you're doing relative to others. So this is actually a mathematical formula to capture predictively whether somebody's going to be happy. And it's recently been updated to show that you're more likely to be happy if you're aware that other people are doing well too, which is very altruistic of us. I'm very encouraged when I started to write TrendsWatch to go out into the museum realm. I never write about a trend until I begin to find museums that are taking advantage of this trend, responding to this trend, doing something around them. And I very quickly came across a couple of major projects tackling this head on, one of which was the Happy Museum Project in the UK, which is working with a number of museums in their country to try and measure how they affect the well-being of their communities. And somewhat closer to home, I stumbled across the fact that the Museum of Vancouver had hosted Stephen Sagmeister's Happy Show, which was that artist's meditation on what makes him happy. But what really intrigued me was the museum's motivation for doing the show, at least as it was reflected in the press, which is there were apparently studies that showed that Vancouver was not a particularly happy city. And the Museum of Vancouver, which seems to me from my reading is very community-centric and very dedicated to serving its city, said, well, what could we do about that? Maybe there's something that we as a museum can do to increase the happiness of our community, which is why I invited Greg Dreiser from Move to join us today to tell us more about that work. So, Greg, do you want to come on board now out of the green room?
Yes. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really looking forward to this chance to chat and share the conversation with others because there's so much more I want to know about the Museum of Vancouver's work in this area, much of which, as you know, I only am familiar with through reading press accounts and through the little bit you've been nice enough to write for me and contribute to the blog.
Yes. Well, we brought Stefan Sagmeister's Happy Show here as kind of kicking off our new focus on looking at people's sense of happiness. And, as you said, individual happiness, it's very interesting. People know if they're happy, in the moment, and they know if they're happy kind of long term, but they don't know necessarily what makes them happy. Like, we don't do things necessarily that make us happy, even though we think we know what makes us happy. So there's a big element of surprise, and it's quite easy to engage people in thinking about it just by actually showing them various methods or strategies for becoming happier. Now, the real key for me was that if people connect with others, they're happier as individuals. But if they connect with others, they're also increasing the well-being of their communities. And so it's really a special insight because there are really probably relatively few people who are going to have the time or the motivation to go out there, volunteer, do things to improve their community. I wish there were more. But in fact, just by doing what makes you happy, you can actually help communities. And why is that? Well, when you look at things like health, sustainability, resilience, which is the ability of communities or people to bounce back after something bad, a disaster, all of that is actually related to social connection. So there's this important link between, individual happiness, because individual happiness is often driven by our connection to others, and then the way that helps strengthen a community.
So this is really interesting. So you're saying that there are measurable increases in community happiness and well-being, even if it's just from the increased individual happiness of people, even if they're not interacting with each other around that?
Yes. I mean, for example, after disasters, when they've studied which communities are able to bounce back, the ones that have stronger social ties are actually the ones that bounce back quicker. And it's interesting, it's better for everyone if they're more connected to their neighbors, basically. And it's also better for city and governments realize this. They don't have the resources to actually be there. After an earthquake or a flood, there's not going to be a team waiting for each family, waiting to save each family. It's actually much more important for you to know your neighbors. And so, yes, it's those relationships which are really critical for community strength.
So what sort of role do you think museums in general, or the Museum of Vancouver in particular, can play in creating those kinds of community connections?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of concern in Vancouver, and I think Vancouver is really in the forefront of the cities that are looking at this issue. It was kicked off in 2012. The Vancouver Foundation published a study on connection in the city. And then actually the government took it up. The mayor established a special task force. And there are actually now very large plans for the city, including the Healthy City Strategy, which the core of which actually focuses on connection. And so I feel that, whether in your TrendsWatch you mentioned, individual happiness. I think it's great if someone comes to a museum and is happier as a result. We definitely want people to be inspired or to learn things. Maybe they'll leave sadder from visiting a museum, but inspired. But I think what's really critical is the social connection piece, that we can help people first of all just understand why connection is so important. It's easy to assume it's obvious, but there are a lot of aspects that people just don't realize. So helping people learn a little bit about why connection is important, but also helping them or inspiring them to connect. And so the benefit then is really for the community. And that's, I think, part of our larger strategy, which is really, community engagement in the sense that our vision is about helping the community rather than, being kind of internally focused, which is a way some museums still are. It's a traditional way museum, looking internally, saying we have collections because we need to, for posterity, we need to preserve collections. Instead, we can say we're going to use collections to actually help connect people with each other, help them create stories together, for example. So I think our focus on happiness and well-being is actually about helping to strengthen the community.
Mm-hmm. So is this taking you in a continued direction at the museum? Was the Happy Show pretty much a one-off, or is this inspired continued work?
Oh yeah, no, not at all. It was I guess it was kind of the kickoff. We're in many ways going to in everything we do. We're in particular looking at creating connections. Probably many of the listeners know bridging and bonding is a kind of academic term for what we're looking at, which is bringing individuals and really bringing groups of people together. So we're actually integrating this into every project that we do. For example, we just opened an exhibition called All Together Now, which looks at collectors, actually a variety of collectors of very unusual objects in Vancouver. And we're looking at it from the perspective of collecting is connecting. when people collect, they're immediately connecting with others to acquire their collections, to show their collections, and then to connect with other collectors, and then to connect with a wider public. So we're taking that angle from kind of the individual collector level, and then we're also bringing together regional institutions to look at how our collecting plans might connect with each other, how we collaborate, and also how we can bring in local communities who are interested in collecting objects themselves, and so we can bring people together that way. Another example is we're working on a project tentatively entitled Trust, because trust is really a basic condition for relationships. It's not the only thing you need to have a good relationship, but without it, you don't really have a firm or reliable relationship. And that runs from individuals to banking, to who fixes your car, real estate, every aspect of society, police. So what we're going to do is, and actually thanks to a grant we just received from the Vancouver Foundation, we're going to do an unusual project where we're engaging with people who are have been designated as isolated, in particular newcomers. And Vancouver is a city. 3/4 of the people who live in Vancouver were not born in the province of British Columbia, and also young people, because interesting, young adults also report feeling very isolated. Vancouver is an extremely diverse city, and there are a lot of people moving in and out, and a lot of change. And as many people know, it's one of the most expensive places to live in the world. So there's a lot of anxiety and people feeling disconnected. And so we're going to work with the isolated groups to actually look at stories, develop stories, and see what the key, key factors or events or situations, and then we're going to collaborate with designers and artists and build on those stories and working with communities to create a variety of events, what are called events and programs, and then eventually actually create an exhibition that's going to revolve around stories about trust and engaging people in learning about trust, being inspired to interact with each other, and actually maybe create real relationships. And we're working closely with the city, because the city is also trying to figure out how they can do what they want to do and need to do here in terms of connection. And so we're hoping to be able also to actually monitor impact, which obviously is really important. I think obviously it's difficult to test whether people are going to be happier. It's very, attitudes and behaviors are really hard to monitor long term, but there are ways that we can indicate and monitor whether people are more connected, and which we hope to do.
This is very interesting, because you're really expanding and riffing on the same topic, which is important outcomes that are non-financial metrics of success. So we've expanded it from happiness to well-being to resilience, from resilience to trust, and they're all interconnected in some way to some degree. Yes. It's a really thorny knot. I know one of the most disturbing pieces of research I've read in the past few years was some research that showed that as communities become more diverse, trust goes down. That's just really depressing. Because if we're talking about trying to create with an increasing number of people living in cities, and with the increasing rate of migration and moving of populations around the world, we're going to have more diverse communities that need their resilience and need their well-being. And if that kind of bringing together of people of different backgrounds and religions and experiences decreases trust, it undermines their ability to cope and be resilient as a community. The thought that a museum could help counteract that to build trust is I find very very encouraging.
Yes, and it's an interesting point that you bring up, because everyone's always talking about community in a positive way, which they should. However, by definition, community means exclusion. If you're defining a community, then there are people who are in it and there are people who are out of it. And I mean, that has been basic. That's basically what a city is. People talk about beyond the pale, for example. Pale being the kind of fence that surrounded a city. So cohesion also means exclusion. But I do think, as you said, that a museum can play a really great role in bringing together groups that actually would not meet or maybe have difference, and doing that, with individuals as well as groups. And I think, again, museum being a trusted institution can play a really special role and really have an impact in how strong the community is, how resilient.
Well, I'm going to be encouraging people in the audience to start lobbing questions at you and or me and Barry. But I'm going to start out with one that we talked about earlier before we started the recording, which is, have you seen, one of the things I mentioned in the report is the fact that museums might want to think about promoting the happiness of their own staff. So thinking about this as an internal metric as well as an external metric. And in part, this ties to the whole question of what nonprofits can pay and what they can't pay and how they can be awesome workplaces that may have payoffs beyond the financial. Did you have any discussions in the museum, and excuse me because I'm dropping this one on you cold, but any discussions in the museum during the course of these projects about how to increase or measure or track happiness or well-being internally?
Yeah. We haven't yet addressed that here. It's a great question, and still one to be determined. We do, I'm working with a well-known social practice artist, Justin Langlois. He's a partner in the Trust Project, and one thing that we are focusing on for the project itself is actually making sure that we're building trust among the partners, because there are going to be so many people involved at different levels. So we are thinking about that at that level. But at the museum level, here in Vancouver, we haven't yet done that. I can say, though, this is my own perspective, that I think a lot, for many museums, the happiness, if you want to call it that, the happiness or well-being level is coming from the top. And so I think for boards, governance, boards should keep a close eye on the leadership of the institutions, because that's something that comes down from the top, and if that's not being carefully monitored, there are going to be issues.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The other thing I've been reading about is about the connection between the physical built environment and people's well-being and happiness. And I listened to a really interesting podcast the other week on Jacob Morgan's Future of Work podcast, where he was interviewing Tim Oldman, who's the CEO of a company called Leesman that goes around auditing the relationship between employees and the physical space they work in.
Yes.
And he was sharing some. So Jacob Morgan was pushing him on what's sort of the strongest correlation to happy, productive employees who feel good about the organization they work for. And I was really encouraged to hear that some of the things he was talking about really are things that don't require a huge amount of money necessarily, but more just thoughtful design. Because some of the strongest influencers were having, first of all, social workspaces, so shared spaces to hang out and have informal encounters with people, to have a variety of different workspaces, and to have flexibility about choice about where you worked going in. So, I'm not just going to necessarily sit down in my cubicle today. There's nothing inherently wrong with cubicles, but that I might go work in a kitchen today. I might go hang out in this lounge area where we're going to have flexible Wi-Fi and places where I can drop in. I might go to this little conference room for a small team meeting. I might even go out to the local coffee shop and work there. So a lot of it seemed to be about giving people choices and control over their environment. And that seemed to me to be something that could be implemented in design even in relatively small organizations.
Yes, I agree that it's on a in the office world, the design of workspaces is critical. I'm not sure a lot of people would agree with you that cubicles are okay. But that aside, environmental design is critical, even on a bigger scale. For example, Charles Montgomery, who wrote the book Happy City and now is consulting actually all over the world with governments about design and happiness, and he's based here in Vancouver. His book actually goes into depth about how our surroundings affect us. And for anyone who works in a museum, actually this isn't news, because for any exhibition, creating the environment is the key thing. If you want to create a memory, impression on someone. It's all about creating an environment that's going to really touch people.
It's multisensory. Yeah.
Correct. And it's interesting. There's a project. We're going to be doing a series of kind of symposia and conferences on different aspects of social connection, and one of them will be collaborating with Charles Montgomery, where he's looking at high-rise buildings, and multi-unit buildings. People in Vancouver, there are a lot of them, and many cities, obviously. But are they designed for people to connect? I mean, mostly, if you talk to developers, it's not even on their minds. Many of them, it's just about getting the most return for your dollar. But how are people actually? Are they connecting? Are they lonely in those buildings?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the other factors the Leesman Index uncovered that is a matter of having money to some extent is that the strongest predictor of employees feeling high well-being and happiness and productivity was a big foyer space in the building, which of course is low density, absolutely useless when it looks at any kind of objective utility, but somehow they haven't dug into the cause and effect that makes people feel good about the building and about the space they're in.
Yes.
Well, since I was just going to, as we continue, I was going to encourage Barry to jump in because it seems to me that this is circling back to the question of sensory perceptions and your experience of what you're perceiving in a space opens the door to think about how AR and VR experiences have effects on emotion as well, including happiness and well-being and potentially trust,
Sure.
since we were talking about VR as empathy engines.
First, I want to thank you for the virtual seltzer in the green room. It was really refreshing. But yeah, well, Greg, and Greg were speaking. It was hard for me not to notice that. One of the things you're focusing on in part is how important it is to support connections in society, and one of the roles that museums play in helping people to build those connections. And what you and I were talking about earlier, Elizabeth, is one of the ways we can think about the important role that things like for VR and AR can have in museums is to help people make those connections with each other. And then perhaps in museums, that's not the place to do things that are about breaking those connections. That might be fine at home. I did like playing that Cracker Jacks game, I should mention. I did it in my office by myself. It worked. That was appropriate time for me to do it by myself. But when I was with my family watching the baseball game, when I was with my family at the museum, I was there to make memories. I was there to build connections with them. And having an augmented tool that gave me a new resource to do that, or just an opportunity or a new activity to do that, enhanced my experience and my family's experience in the museum, and perhaps that made us happier. So for me, it's just bringing the conversation full circle. Technology, not just AR and VR, technology to the extent that it helps us connect with those around us, with those we love, with our friends, and potentially even make connections with those we don't know, with strangers, with those different from us. Those are, I think, very beneficial, powerful ways that we can be supporting technology in our social and civic spaces. And we should be concerned at places where the technology is making us disconnect. The one thing I would say around that is it's sometimes difficult to know what's going on. Graham Devine from Magic Leap was actually talking about his experience in a museum when he was at Games for Change, seeing a whole bunch of students sitting in front of a beautiful piece of art in an art museum looking at their cell phones. And he thought, look at this mobile device. It's disconnecting them from the art. But then when he went up to see what they were doing, he saw that they were actually part of a class using an augmented reality experience where they were actually interacting with the art. And this was just a moment when they were looking at the phone instead of looking at the device. But the device was actually having them connect with the art and with each other. So sometimes it's hard when we're outside the experience to know what's going on. And I find I have to reserve my judgment sometimes until I can see how are people experiencing what the technology is affording them in that space.
Super. Well, I think that's a great way of bringing it full circle, because it's pointing out that any technology is a tool, and any tool needs to be deployed towards a certain end, and we need to be thinking about what are the effects that we're trying to produce with those tools, whether it's social connections, whether it's well-being and happiness, whether it's fostering trust. And there are new AR and VR tools for working on that, and there are also the old-fashioned ways that museums have done it for centuries. So I think we're getting the high sign that we should be wrapping up. Is that correct, Laura?
That is correct, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to take a minute, as I thank you all for joining us, to point you towards more places that you can find great content contributed by people like Greg and Barry and people from across the field, and some of my thoughts as well. It's all compiled at the AAM website. You can shortcut the CFM portions by going to www.futureofmuseums.org. We have blog posts, several of them a week, over at Blogspot. You can find me on Twitter, where I push out links to everything I possibly can that I think is an interesting read. If you're more of a visual person, you can check out Pinterest, where I pin interesting images of things going on in the world, and on YouTube, where I feature videos of people who are willing to put themselves on film talking about their visions of the future.
Whatever
Thank
you can do,
to Blackball.
get into Elizabeth's stream.
Thank you, Barry. And thank you, Laura, and thank you, Blackbot, for hosting us today.
Well, on behalf of the Blackbot Arts and Cultural team, thank you guys so much, Elizabeth, Barry, Gregory, for joining us today. And thank you for everyone who joined to listen in as well. I hope you're leaving here today with fresh ideas and inspiration that you can take back to your organization. And then finally, if you haven't yet, be sure to check out our site, arts.blackbot.com, for resources, news, and more webinars and events like this one, specifically for arts and cultural organizations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.